The New York Giants have moved on from the Brian Daboll, Wink Martindale saga. Giants fans, though, don't appear to be quite as ready to do that. Today on the Valentine's Views podcast, I'll answer some mailbag questions in hopes of helping you guys do just that. Please like, share, and subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts across the Big Blue View radio network. We know what the situation is with the New York Giants at this point in time. Wink Martindale is no longer the defensive coordinator for the New York Giants. Brian Daboll remains the head coach heading into a third season, which will be a critical year for Daboll, Joe Schoen, and the Giants. There's been a lot of reporting over the last couple of weeks about the Martindale-Daboll saga, about it's a he said at this point. There's been reporting from the Martindale perspective that that Daboll is a screamer, that he doesn't treat assistant coaches well, that behind the scenes he's overly hard on them, that during games his volatility and his tendency to scream into the headset makes it hard for position coaches, for coordinators to do their jobs on game days. Been reporting on the other side about how Martindale and Drew and Kevin Wilkins, who were basically Martindale cronies or underlings, felt like they didn't report to Brian Daboll, felt like they operated separately. Been some examples of how all of that may have played out behind the scenes with the Giants. We know ultimately that Brian Daboll fired Drew and Kevin Wilkins, that Martindale reacted explosively, and that led to the two sides parting ways. But as I said, there's still been a whole lot of he said back and forth, and who did this and who did that. And I thought that what I would do today is answer some mailbag questions. So many questions came into the Big Blue View mailbag this week and over the last week and a half or so. I can't answer all of them. At least not in one mailbag. The Saturday mailbag at Big Blue View is going to be a non-Wink Martindale edition of the mailbag. What I'm going to try to do today is answer the Martindale questions and then wrap this podcast into the Saturday mailbag for those of you who want answers to the Daboll-Martindale situation. And before I get into it, I'm going to preface it with this. I don't have a ton of inside sources of information on this. I'm using my observations of Brian Daboll, my observations of Wink Martindale, from having been around the facility, from having seen how the two of them operate, up close. What I know about the reporters who have been out front with some of the information on both sides of the story. I've worked with a lot of these guys for years now, and I know who to trust. I know who not to trust. To be honest, there are reporters who have agendas, who basically take sides at times. And I'm not going to say who's who, but I understand that everyone has a little bit of a different agenda, that everyone approaches their jobs a little bit differently. And I have my own feelings on who I trust, who I respect, who I think does good quality work, that tries not to bend the truth in favor of one side or the other. And that all of that is how I'm going to approach trying to answer some of these questions. All right, with all of that preamble, let's get into some of the Martindale Daboll related questions that have been sent into the Big Blue View mailbag recently. All right, first one, Don Fressy wants to know if I think Brian Daboll's temperament issues will ultimately harm his career, and whether anyone in management has talked to him about it. Don, I think what ultimately harms any head coach's career is whether they win enough games. If you don't win enough games, you don't get to stay. if you win enough games, nobody really cares if you're hard on people, if you yell at people, nobody really cares whether everybody likes you or not. The bottom line is if you win games, then you have a good career. If Brian Daboll wins games in 2024, if he gets to stay in 2025 and wins games, all of this is going to be a footnote. If he loses, if the Giants are 4-13 in 2024, Brian Daboll probably doesn't get to see 2025. That is really what matters, and that record is ultimately what's going to determine, Brian Daboll's coaching career with the New York Giants, is whether he wins games or loses games. Does his volatility, if indeed he is as volatile as reports indicate, and listen, we all need to take all of this reporting with a grain of salt. I don't know who, these sources are anonymous, and I know that over the years I've talked to plenty of people, including people about the Daboll-Martindale dynamics. And I know that anonymous sources sometimes are aligned with one camp or the other, sometimes have an axe to grind, sometimes have their own personal feelings about one head coach or the other, even if they're not aligned with either side. So you have to take all of this with a grain of salt. There's probably some truth on each side of the equation here, probably some truth in regards to Daboll's volatility, probably some truth in regards to Wink Martindale and the Wilkins brothers acting as though they did not have to report to Brian Daboll. The word that Paul Schwartz used was that trio thought they were their own little fiefdom and could do what they wanted. And Schwartz over the time has provided some evidence of that. And we also know, that where there's smoke, there's fire when it comes to the reports that Brian Daboll is sometimes hard on assistant coaches. But in reality, what is going to impact Brian Daboll's career one way or the other is whether or not the New York Giants win enough football games. If they're bad in 2024, then Brian Daboll probably is out. Perhaps in the long run, some of the reports about his volatility and the reasons why the Giants, if Daboll ultimately gets fired, maybe some of the reports of his volatility might impact his ability to get another job. But again, I think it's really about winning and losing. Along that same line, Don Mushinski wants to know if Daboll's volatile behavior toward assistants will be a detriment to landing top assistant coaches with so many good openings available, and whether I think John Mara will talk to Daboll about his behavior. Don, I think that we've already seen that whatever the situation, Brian Daboll is still able to attract quality assistant coaches. He's still able to attract guys who other teams want, who have done good jobs in other places. Offensive line coach Carmen Brasillo came from the Raiders. Brasillo, of course, worked with Dante Scarnecchia. Brasillo's a guy who has coached good offensive lines with the Las Vegas Raiders for the last couple of years. Obviously, as I said, also is familiar with the teachings of Dante Scarnecchia from his time with the Patriots. And listen, do you think that Carmen Brasillo's ever got yelled at by Bill Belichick? I'm sure he probably did. You know, Brian Daboll's not the only head coach who's ever yelled at an assistant coach. Do you think that Phil Simms was the only person in the Giants organization who Bill Parcells ever yelled at? I'm sure he yelled at assistant coaches at times. I'm sure he yelled at other players at times. Head coaches yelling at assistant coaches is nothing new. Now, whether Brian Daboll's behavior at times crosses a line, that I don't know. Whether, There have been reports that his behavior on game day, and we've seen some of his outbursts on the sideline. There have been reports that some of his behavior makes it difficult for assistant coaches at times to do their jobs. And again, is that reporting accurate? Is that axe to grind sources, simply trying to make Daboll look bad? I don't know the answer to that fully, but in terms of Daboll being able to hire assistant coaches, Brasillo's an example of bringing in a highly thought of assistant coach. Joel Thomas, the running backs coach that the Giants hired, is a guy who's been in New Orleans since 2015, a guy who, had the Giants not hired him, would have had options to go elsewhere. So right now, I don't see indications that the Giants are going to have a hard time bringing in other quality assistant coaches. But we'll see how that plays out as the Giants continue to fill out this staff. Very, very curious to see who ends up in the end with the defensive coordinator job. Very curious in the end to see if Mike Kafka, who's had a couple of head coaching interviews in this cycle, ends up with a head coaching job, or perhaps moves on to another team as offensive coordinator. Once some of these teams hire head coaches, perhaps if Kafka doesn't get one of those openings, I would bet that there are teams who ask about Kafka's availability to come to them as offensive coordinator. Do I think John Mara will talk to Daboll about that behavior? I'm sure that if John Mara and if GM Joe Shane think that Brian Daboll needs to make some adjustments, needs to evolve a little bit in the way that he handles himself, I'm sure that they'll talk to him about that. If they feel like something needs to change in the way that he treats people, they're not going to just sit back and do nothing about that. I'm sure that they'll have discussions with him, and coaches evolve, people evolve. People, Daboll has said in the past that he was very, very, very hard, too hard at times on players early in his coaching career, and has had to learn to change. Players love Daboll. Players support Brian Daboll. They love the fact that he's cognizant of keeping them fresh, keeping them healthy, of not overworking them throughout the spring and the summer and through practices. So if he's been able to evolve in that sense, I'm sure that if he's aware that he's at times been overly harsh. Remember, this is his first head coaching job. He's still learning some things about how to do this. And I'm sure that if he gets that kind of feedback and understands that kind of feedback, that he will try to evolve as well. All right, let's get to another question. This one from Chris Chianese, who is a regular in the Big Blue View mailbag each week. Chris wants to know, first of all, he says that he understands we need to move on from the Daboll Wink situation, but he does have a question about the reports that Martindale and his underlings felt like they reported to John Mara. And he wants to know, he says that it surprised him that Mara would have allowed that. And Chris, I answer that by saying we're here on Friday, January 19th. That's the day that this podcast is airing. Who has a job with the New York Giants and who doesn't have a job with the New York Giants? Brian Daboll remains the head coach. Wink Martindale, as I record this show, is looking for a new job in the NFL. If John Mara was allowing Wink Martindale to report directly to him and believed some of the things or all of the things that Wink Martindale has said that Brian Daboll allegedly has done. If John Mara was siding with Wink Martindale, Wink Martindale would still have a job. Brian Daboll would be the one looking for work. Wink Martindale might be the head coach at this point if John Mara was siding with Wink Martindale. What we know, or what we can surmise, is that Wink Martindale felt that he did not have to answer to Brian Daboll. Wink Martindale seemed to feel like, I don't want to say felt like he was the co-head coach, but Wink Martindale seemed to feel like the defense was his domain, his purview, his place to make decisions, and that he didn't necessarily have to answer to or take suggestions from Brian Daboll. I mean, there was a report recently from Paul Schwartz that Tomon Fox, practice squad edge rusher, had changed his uniform number unbeknownst to Daboll or Shane, simply because Martindale had planned to activate him from the practice squad for a game toward the end of the season. Meanwhile, that's not Wink Martindale's decision. That is not the defensive coordinator's decision. Who gets brought up is the purview of the head coach and the general manager. It is not the purview or the decision of the coordinator. Wink Martindale's responsibility in that instance would have been to go to Daboll and go to Shane and say, I really would like to elevate Tomon Fox from the practice squad this week. I have a plan for him. This is how I would like to use him. Can we make that happen? So for me, I think the indication is that Wink Martindale may have had an impression. He may have felt a certain way, but I don't see evidence that John Mara was allowing that to happen. I think that if John Mara was allowing that to happen, that Wink Martindale would still have a job. I think that if John Mara was siding with the defensive coordinator, he would not have stood on the sidelines and allowed Daboll to fire Martindale's most trusted assistants and more or less push the defensive coordinator out the door. All right. Robert Forgione wants to know if I think Joe Shane was aware of Brian Daboll's anger issues, and would Schoen pull the plug on Daboll at some point, or would John Mara and Steve Tisch have to force him to do that? Robert, I'm certain that Joe Shane has eyes and ears. Joe Shane's in the building. Joe Shane's in the coach's room. He's in the locker room at times during the week. I'm sure he's heard some of what goes on. I'm sure he's seen some of what goes on. I'm sure he's aware of Brian Daboll's volatility or reported volatility. So, he doesn't have his head in the sand. And I think that no one can predict, how a person will react to a situation they've never been in before. Brian Daboll was offensive coordinator for the Buffalo Bills. He was offensive coordinator in several places prior to that. Had never been a head coach before he came to the New York Giants. It made perfect sense for Joe Shane to bring Brian Daboll in, as the two of them are aligned philosophically. They make most decisions about the roster, about the draft. They make most of their decisions together. So if Brian Daboll is overly volatile, I'm not sure that Joe Shane could have predicted that. Would Joe Shane pull the plug on Daboll and fire him? Not at this point. I don't think there's any reason to at this point. It's 2 years in. Giants had a really good first year under Daboll. Whether there were some underlying issues, I think Joe Shane has said that maybe they overlooked some things after a first year that that was much better than expected, winning a playoff game and all of that? Were there some underlying issues, in the way that Daboll was operating that maybe got glossed over because of the winning? Sure, that's entirely possible. But do I think at this point that Shane would pull the plug on Daboll? No, I don't. Do I think maybe a year from now he would pull the plug on Daboll? That's entirely possible. And again, my gut feeling is here the Giants like stability. They're a conservative organization by nature. I think that ideally, Daboll and Shane are a pair. Ideally, they came in together. Ideally, they would go out together. Um, I think that depending on how the Giants view, how ownership views Joe Shane's work with the roster, I tend to think that the GM might have a longer runway than the head coach, but there's also the possibility that since they came in together, if ownership wants one to go, then the other one is going to go. And that has always been really an ownership decision. Would they step aside and let Schoen make that decision? Perhaps, because they have stepped aside and allowed Shane to make more decisions on his own without than perhaps the Giants had done in the past. But I still think that the organization looks at them as a duo, and best guess is, for me anyway, that if one goes, both go. All right, let's see what else we have here for questions. Dennis Carletto wants to know um, whether or not basically Dennis wants to know if Mara would get to the point where, with guys like Bill Belichick, Pete Carroll, Jim Harbaugh, Mike Vrabel available, if he would move on from Brian Daboll at this point in time, or whether he should. And listen, Dennis, as I've already said, John Mara is aware of what goes on. He's in the building every day. He's at practice almost all the time. If there are issues between coaches, if there are issues in the way that Brian Daboll treats people, he's aware of those things. And it's my belief that he and Joe Shane, as I've already said, will speak to Daboll about that and and ask him to try to evolve. And again, we don't know exactly how widespread the issues are. I do know from some of the people that I have talked to that Brian Daboll not only has support from players in that locker room, but he has support from others on that coaching staff and in that organization as well. So it's not like everyone working for Brian Daboll on that coaching staff hates the man. Um, sometimes people get along, sometimes they don't. The the biggest problem on the coaching staff, which appeared to be Martindale's inability to get along with, inability to understand who the boss was. That problem's been removed, and the Giants are moving on. I don't see a scenario where Brian Daboll loses his job this offseason. I think that would have happened already. As I've been trying to say here, I think the Giants have moved on, and Daboll is now trying to rebuild a staff. It's not a great look that he has to replace two coordinators and that he might have to replace a third coordinator if Mike Kafka decides to move on. Not a great look that he has to do that after 2 years he has to rebuild so much of this coaching staff. But it is what it is. I think Brian Daboll's going to get more time, at least the 2024 season, maybe longer than that, to see if the Giants can get this pointed in the right direction. All right. Taj Siddiqui wants to know, this will be the final question that that I take today that I answer in this version of the mailbag. Taj Siddiqui says, I believe the upheaval of the coaching staff will set the team back in the upcoming season. Another lousy season of Giants football is in the making, and a lot has to do with Daboll's abrasive personality, according to many reports. Uh, Taj wants to know how I feel about the accuracy of these reports and whether I agree with his assessment that it feels like the Giants are headed in the wrong direction. Taj, I think how I feel about a lot of these reports is something that I've already answered. I think there's truth on both sides. I think you have to take it all with a grain of salt. I think you have to understand these are all anonymous sources. So we don't know, you know, we don't know if these are people with axes to grind. We don't know if a lot of these sources are guys who are no longer in the building. We don't know if when a source is someone inside the organization. That could be John Mara, and it could be an equipment manager. Who knows? It could be, it could be a security guard. Who knows? So take it all with a grain of salt. I still believe that the New York Giants, who've been mostly bad for more than a decade now, I still have faith that largely because they're a duo, because they're smart people, I still have faith that the Brian Daboll, Joe Shane duo can get the Giants pointed in the right direction. Now, as I said, it may not be a good look that they've had a lot of changes or are in the midst of having a lot of changes to the coaching staff. But what matters is whether they get the coaching staff right. I don't see Carmen Brasillo having been hired as a yes sir head coach or a yes man for Brian Daboll. I don't see Joel Thomas, their new running backs coach, having been hired to simply be a yes man for Brian Daboll. These guys have been around the league for too long. They've worked for too many quality head coaches. Joel Thomas, for example, worked several years for Sean Payton in New Orleans. These are quality head coaches who are qualified to do the jobs that they're being asked to do. Most of the interview requests that we've seen from the Giants are quality head coaches who have done well in other places. It it may feel like right now the Giants are a mess because the beginning of their offseason has been messy. There's been a lot of reporting on both sides. We're learning that Brian Daboll's not a perfect human being. We've learned that maybe Wink Martindale wasn't the nice guy that we all thought he was. That maybe he had an agenda behind the scenes that wasn't always to support Brian Daboll and wasn't always team oriented. So, but so, all of that is what it is, but all of that is done now. I think that what matters is whether or not the New York Giants get the hires of the new coaches correct. Do they get a quality defensive coordinator who can continue to build that side of the ball? Is Brasillo the right coach for the offensive line? Can they get more players? Can they fix this offensive line? Can they add pieces to it? Can they get another difference maker or two on the defensive side of the ball? It's been a messy start to the offseason, but it's a long offseason. This is the middle of January. Games are not played until next September. So it as I said, it's messy and it's not ideal and it's not what you'd like. You'd like everything to be in perfect harmony, and maybe when we get to training camp, maybe it will be. Maybe a lot of these questions will have been answered, but I don't see the Giants as heading in the wrong direction. I see them as bit by bit trying to build a team that can get back to being a consistent contender. I think that there have been ups and downs in Brian Daboll's first 2 years. I think that Had Brian Daboll gone 6-11 in his first year and then gone 10-8-1 with a playoff victory in his second year, I think people would feel much differently about the direction of the franchise after his first 2 years. The overall result is the same. I think the Giants are pointed in a better direction than they have been in quite a while, despite some of this upheaval. We'll have to see. Maybe I'm wearing blue colored glasses. I don't know. I don't think I am. I think that is what I see and what I feel from my being around the building, from my being around the players, and we'll see if I'm right. We'll know in another year, in another 2 years, if Brian Daboll and Joe Shane are the right duo to get things turned around for the New York Giants. All right, I hope that that little Q&A, little Friday mailbag has helped you guys understand a little bit more about the Daboll-Martindale situation. I hope it's helped kind of put that to bed a little bit. As I said at the top of the show, the Giants have moved on. It's time for the fan base to move on. It's time for everyone to look forward to what comes next. And at least in my view, stop trying to dissect why why things went wrong between Daboll and Martindale. Wink is gone. The Giants will have a new defensive coordinator. Daboll will still be the head coach. Joe Shane will still be the GM, and we move on to getting ready for the 2024 season. So, all right, Giants fans, thank you as always for listening. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.